What's a situation where the worst that could possibly happen actually happened? When Captain Billy Tyne decided to take the Andrea Gail out for one last fishing trip, they go beyond their usual fishing grounds, lose vital communications equipment and, while trying to outrun a thunderstorm, get caught between a hurricane and a cold front. One rescue helicopter manages to locate them, but then equipment failure causes the crew to abandon the vehicle, dooming the rescue, and the fishing vessel goes down, killing all. Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979. They completely destroyed Cambodia, economically, politically, and demographically. Anyone who was deemed an intellectual was killed. This could just mean you wore glasses. It particularly applied to anyone going to school and teachers. Pol Pot decided everyone needed to move from the city onto farms, regardless of skill. Any action deemed to be contrasting to his rule was met with death. Death was brought by machete, electrocution, starvation, forced eating of feces, guards' feces not your own. In the end, over 20% of the country was murdered. Pol Pot lived a long life and finally died in 1998 of a heart attack. Chernobyl. Reactor safeties and containments were taken offline to test something. The workers didn't use their protective gear properly. The alarms, both auditory and visual, were disabled. WTF was going on there? The test was actually delayed, so when it was conducted, the crew that had prepared and trained for it had left and the crew that replaced them without preparing for it ran the test. A valve was left open in a pipe, causing the Bhopal gas disaster. For those who don't know, on the night of the 2nd of December, 1984, an accident at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released at least 30 tons of a highly toxic gas called methyl isocyanate, as well as a number of other poisonous gases. The pesticide plant was surrounded by shanty towns, leading to more than 600,000 people being exposed to the deadly gas cloud that night. The gases stayed low to the ground, causing victims' throats and eyes to burn, inducing nausea, and many deaths. Estimates of the death toll vary from as few as 3,800 to as many as 16,000, but government figures now refer to an estimate of 15,000 killed over the years. Toxic material remains, and 30 years later, many of those who were exposed to the gas have given birth to physically and mentally disabled children. I swear I've seen this mentioned on Reddit so many times lately. Went to the ER for having night sweats and muscle spasms and a cough, which I was pretty sure not related. I was told it could be pneumonia, a punctured lung, back infection and of course cancer, which he kind of whispered. Came back and closed the door to the ER room, kneeled down and told me that it was probably Hodgkin's lymphoma but not to worry, it was only above the diaphragm. Hadn't scanned anything below the diaphragm yet. Ended up being Hodgkin's stage IV. I was 29. Oh, but Hodgkin's is the best kind of cancer to have. It has a 97% survival rate. I ended up being on the other 3% as my disease resisted treatment. So then a bone marrow transplant's a 75% survival rate. 25% seems much more than 3% now. Survived that but then went back to the ICU 3 months later and the doctor told my husband that I wasn't going to make it through the night. Survived that but went back to the ICU again the next month and almost bled out when the arterial blood pressure monitor fricked up. Survived that as well. So now I'm here 6 years later. I have a weak and busted up immune system and a host of other problems but I'm here. So by the 6th major incident it did not go the worst way imaginable. I am left with a pretty great perspective on what really matters in life. And I'm thankful that I got a 6th shot of surviving. You know those times as a guy when you're just standing peeing but also need to fart, and occasionally it almost feels like you're going to crap yourself? Well, once I actually did crap myself. I go for reading about the Cambodian genocide to this. WTF. Lady Franklin Bay expedition was poorly organized and equipped from the beginning. Got stranded in the Arctic with dwindling provision and no means of coming back. First relief expedition fails because of ice everywhere. Second relief expedition fails for the same reason. People start dying from hunger. The guy with the only working rifle accidentally drowns. They try to go south by boat but there's no open water. Everything is frozen. They try to go south on foot but the drifting of ice constantly moves them back. When everyone who is not dead yet is so exhausted they can't walk anymore and just sit in their tent awaiting death, the ice freaking melts, open water, free to go, but the boat is abandoned long ago and there's nothing they can do. Finally, the last relief expedition shows up and manages to save 6 people left. The 7th died on the way back. All his limbs had been amputated due to frostbite and gangrene. Everything that could go wrong with that expedition went wrong. At least a few people got out alive. Both of our sons were driving home together from the older one's 17th birthday party that they went to with friends after school. The car was hit by a box truck half a mile from home. We lost them both. They were our only children. I'm so sorry. One day at my grandparents' house out of state. It was our last day at their house and we were leaving to go to the airport in 1.5 hours. I was following my mom around in a blanket in their back room with a coffee table, and I tripped on my blanket and hit my forehead on the corner of the coffee table, and cracked my head open. I end up having to get 8 stitches, 6 on the outside and 2 in the muscle. We hurry back to the house and get into the car with 1 hour 45 minutes before the flight leaves. The airport was 30 minutes away. Security would not wave us through even though by the time we got there we were already boarding and the doors would close in 20 minutes. After we got through security we ran through the terminal to our gate and we got there right before the gate closed. So it's all good, right? Nope, not at all. Since I got my stitches out of state, insurance decided not to cover it. This sparked more arguments between my divorced parents in court. We are tried to refute their division for about 2 years before they finally gave in and paid for a large portion of it. World War I. Gallipoli campaign. The New Zealanders at Chinook Bay took the place much to the surprise of everyone who thought they wouldn't capture it as easily as they did because Johnny Turk had pulled out to reinforce other areas that were under attack. During the Turkish counterattack the New Zealanders had to deal with not only the Turks who were counterattacking, but they ran out of ammo, and were resolved to fighting with their bare hands and rocks when artillery and naval bombardments from both sides rained down on the battlefield. The entire battalion was wiped out. Gallipoli was a massive failure in itself, but the Brits never did apologize for bombing the Kiwis who had done so well to take the place in the first place. For those poor souls, it went from bad to worse to couldn't have gotten worse. This isn't to mention the countless pointless attacks where they sacrificed wave after wave of men into machine guns that knew the attackers were coming. It's also speculated that it's one of the reasons why Churchill was a bit reluctant toward a landing in northern France during World War II. He was First Lord of the Admiralty during the Gallipoli campaign and was a first-hand witness of the bloodbath caused by that disastrous landing. In Milton on 40-ish single white male living in his parents' basement got a job as a supervisor at a daycare center, where my friend works. Staff thought he was a bit odd. He also constantly had toddlers who left late from the center. My friend's husband saw a picture of him and made a joke that looks like a pedophile. Weeks later, supervisor got arrested and charged with possession of child pornography that he made with his students and sexual interference. Confirmed pedophile. This crap gives me the creeps. Like you're dropping your kids off at a daycare center. That has to one of the last things you expect to happen. In 1977 some separatist terrorist who wanted independence for the Canary Islands decided to plant a bomb in the flower shop of the Tenerife airport to scare tourists and get attention from foreign media for their struggle. One person got injured in the blast but otherwise everyone was fine. So far so good. However, authorities decided to close down the airport entirely in case there are any other bombs. All incoming planes get diverted to the nearest airport, which happens to be the relatively tiny regional airport of Los Rodeo. The tiny single runway airport gets completely overwhelmed with aircraft. The ATC, who are in no way prepared for that much traffic, end up making a small mistake. They tell a plane to go when they should have told them to stop. 2 planes collide on the runway, killing 583 people in total. It was the deadliest commercial aviation disaster and the greatest amount of deaths from a terrorism strike involving airplanes until the 11th of September, 2001. All from a single bomb that wasn't even supposed to kill anyone. Not to mention that situation is not one anyone could have in any reasonable way predicted and prepared against. Hurricane Katrina and the following aftermath. Every planning phase before it was done wrong. Every chance to prevent the problem was done wrong. Every method to report and obtain information on the extent of the damage was done wrong. Every management aspect following the disaster was done wrong. Finally, tons of charities purporting to support Katrina survivors ran away with the money they got. Absolutely terrible. The only people to do anything right during and after Katrina were the people of New Orleans. Everyone else seemed to freak up from one step to the next. On Finding Nemo, the dad was so overprotective because he had already lost his wife and all his children, eggs. He lets Nemo go to school because Nemo wants to go, even though the dad isn't ready to let him go, and then he gets kidnapped and put in an fish tank owned by P. Sherman at 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney. Either that, or Pol Pot. It's a toss-up. I work in an ice rink and I drive a propane-powered ice resurfacer, specifically Olympia, aka a Zamboni. There are 2 fuel tanks on board at all times, so that when you run out mid-operation, you flip to the other one and keep on going. Worst case scenario is to be out of fuel on the ice, for many reasons. 1. The blade sitting on the ice melts through the ice very fast, way faster than you think. 2. The flood cloth on the back of the machine freezes to the ice. There is an emergency hand pump under the driver's seat though to get the back end off the ice in case of a breakdown. Sounds good, right? One day, I start my shift by checking to make sure I don't have an empty tank sitting on the machine. It happens. People forget. Backup tank is full, and current tank is almost empty. Cool. I'll switch when it runs out. So I go out and start my flood. About halfway through, the low fuel light comes on. I flip the switch to go to the full tank. 5 seconds later, the low fuel light comes back on. For whatever reason it didn't take. The tank was full, and the valve was open. I checked. It starts to chug, and dies out before I can lift the blade. Try to flip back, turn over and scoot off the ice. Nothing. Thing won't even try to turn over. Now we're in trouble. I get out the bar for manual pump and start pumping. Nothing. Apparently the current models require you to press the switch on the panel while pumping for it to work. Unfortunately, when the machine died, I had blown a fuse in the main panel and had no power to the switches. I threw off the flood cloth before it froze, ran back to the shop to grab some broken hockey sticks that were kicking around, and hammered them under the back part to get the blade up. The damage was already done though, as the metal had burned a huge hole into the ice. Took some troubleshooting to finally figure out it was a blown fuse. Luckily, it was just a practice, so I didn't have too big of an audience. You're about to be killed by a Zamboni, is all I would ever say if I was operating one. World War I. Think about it, one not seemingly all that important archduke gets capped and a bunch of secret alliances kick in and it starts the bloodiest war in all of mankind up to that point. If that isn't enough, then that war leads to the spreading of Spanish flu, which kills another 19 million people. Think that's bad? The consequences of World War I led to the rise of fascism, which leads to WWL's action-packed sequel directed by Michael Bay featuring the Holocaust, which kills another 100 million people. And with all of Europe weakened by the war, this leads to Russia becoming a superpower and nearly bringing the world to brink of nuclear winter. Oh, and let's not forget about the Soviets invading Afghanistan, which led to the rise of terror, and then the Taliban, and then 9/11 happened, and that whole skirmish in Vietnam. Mao Zedong initiated the Four Pests campaign in 1958. The goal was to eliminate flies, rats, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The only problem with this was that sparrows ate lots of grain-eating insects such as locusts, and when they were all eradicated from China, the locusts and other grain-eating bugs roamed free and plentiful. This greatly exacerbated the Great Chinese Famine, which caused no less than 20 million deaths. TLDR. Don't frick with sparrows. World War I. All those individual accords and treaties between European nations ended up with a wild-eyed Serbian assassin bringing down the entire house of cards, resulting in 4 years of carnage. And don't forget the fuck-ups from World War I transferred into having another war later down the track. Gavrilo Princip really did make a mark on the world by regressing it by a lot. The start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. 10-year incubation period. Sexual revolution. Homophobic officials refusing to act. CDC, Red Cross, or whichever agency was involved, refusing to test blood for HIV. Good. Had an argument with my mom. She asked me what was really wrong with me, and I told her all the things she did that bugged me. Mom now wishes she never adopted me. Has the Hindenburg been mentioned? I feel someone at one point mentioned, hey, you know that's a very flammable gas, right? To which someone responded, hey, what's the worst that could happen? Mythbusters tried it, and if I recall correctly, the main problem was the paint, not the hydrogen. Well, I remember in high school we were watching Schindler's List, and every single goddamn time something bad happened to the Jews, one of them was always like, it's okay, the worst is over. And then the Nazis were like, surprise, and things got worse every dang time. My best friend in high school had heart problem. He insisted he be included in the school senior football team, soccer, for Mexico's neighbors. Well, he died. Pearl Harbor from the Japanese point of view. Will surprise attack their navy. What's the worst that could happen? Oops, our government was overthrown, our nation is occupied, and millions of civilians died. A young plant-eating dinosaur came across an unfamiliar leaf belonging to a tree he had not seen before. He had been brought up to ignore all plants he did not recognize, as unfamiliar plants could easily contain toxins that could make him sick or even threaten his life. But this plant he had never been warned about, and it might be the most delicious leaf anyone had ever tasted. How would anyone ever find the best tasting leaves if no one tried anything but leaves they had all been consuming for generations? He decided he would be the one to take the risk for the betterment of everyone's taste buds. What's the worst that could happen, he thought, as he leaned over, opened his mouth and closed his eyes to take his first timid bite. Just then a giant meteor smashed into the earth, vaporizing him and every other organism that he had ever come in contact with. The unfathomable amount of dust and debris generated by the immense collision would eventually block out the sun and choke the life from nearly every creature in the entire world. And that's not even the worst mass extinction we've had. I'm pretty sure the guy who got lassoed by the cowboy in a Wal-Mart parking lot in Oregon didn't realize that it was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Heard this from an EMT. A father ended up dying from a heart attack, so his wife and son, teenager, were contacted shortly after. The wife, obviously upset and panicked, goes to meet the father-son at the hospital. Unfortunately, on her way there she ended up getting into a car accident and dying. My grandpa had an X-ray show abnormal matter in his lungs. We thought the worst case scenario was that the biopsy came back positive. It did come back positive, but before that, he stopped breathing during surgery, so they had to perform a tracheotomy and insert a tube down his throat that he would breathe through until further notice. Then, we thought the worst case was that he would have the trash for a few weeks. He recovered. He had it for the rest of his life, and he kept getting sick and needed it cleaned every 2-4 hours. We thought the worst case scenario was that he had a sinus infection that was making him cough so much. He actually had a MRSA infection in his lungs that cost him weeks in the hospital. Then he was released to go home. We thought the worst case scenario then was that we'd have to worry about the chemo making him feel even worse now that he had been treated for the MRSA. What actually happened was that he was never actually cured and his oxygen level dropped dangerously low, so he had to be rushed to another hospital, 2 of which denied him entry because his case was too severe for them to handle. We thought the worst case scenario was that we'd have to drive a long way to visit him and have to spend more than one night at a time with him. What actually happened was that he had a heart attack and died, then was brought back 3 times in a row before my family finally told them to let him go. A few weeks after I had returned to my home out of state, and had to return home without ever having said a proper goodbye or hearing him speak since before he True story. My husband and I were in the process of moving from DC to Seattle. Hubby was driving the moving truck with trailer and I was driving our car with the cat. In the middle of Montana, I was informed that my father had unexpectedly passed away. We pulled over and I got to cry in husband's arms for 20 minutes. And then we had to keep going because we had a schedule to keep. I spent that day by myself driving in my car with my cat. And then in the middle of freaking nowhere Montana an hour later, the trailer got a flat tire. We had no cell phone reception. We pulled over and kindly passerby, who had no idea how fricked up our day really was, told us there was an automotive shop about 30 miles away. So we drove 30 miles per hour on a flat tire to that place. It was less a town and more literally just a widening of the highway. It was run by two elderly good old boys, and they scrounged up a used tire and replaced it for us for a reasonable price. Then we were on our way. All told, we spent 15.5 hours on the road that day because of all the delays. And of course the day your father dies is not the day you want to spend 15.5 hours on the road away from your family without even your husband in the same vehicle as you. After that day, I feel like I can get through anything. I went in for a routine colonoscopy and ended up in emergency surgery having my butthole cut out due to them fricking up. Well, I was put on academic probation last semester and then this past semester I was doing very well. I was going to get off probation and raise my GPA. I do well on the first 2 tests of every class. Got a 31 on a chemistry test. Could not recover. Dropped. It's fine now, I'm just focused on getting my GPA up so I don't get dismissed. Of course I put all my time into studying for one class because I feel confident in another. Do bad on both tests. Think I got kicked out. Find out my teachers passed me and that I might be okay. Didn't fail anything but GPA did not cumulatively go up to the points I needed since the first semester I did so poor. So now I'm fricking around in EMT school that I signed up with the intention to get experience for another graduate school. Now I'm afraid that my dreams of being a PA are gone because of a mix of terrible decisions and the worst of luck. My whole life I've been able to turn bad into good. But now for the first time, I don't think it's fixable. Haven't told my dad I got dismissed. He's sinking money into my undergrad and eventual grad and I worked so hard and got 4.0 for 5 semesters. Then transferred to a big university and got kicked out in 2 semesters. When I was around 12 years old, my grandmother decided she was going to move back to rural East Texas. She had no real family there except a few sisters who were in their last few years of life. She wanted to be there for them before they passed away. This came as a bit of a shock to me. All my life she had lived in NC with me and my dad, and we were quite close. She owned a small fluffy white dog she had rescued from the pound, and it was her best friend. The dog and her did everything together and was really going to be her only family in her new home. The morning she is set to leave, I'm hugging her goodbye before my school bus arrives. We're at my dad's apartment right off a main highway. I'm hugging her as tight as I can before my school bus came. As I'm doing this she loses hold of her leash and the dog starts running around the parking lot. We dart frantically to grab the dog but she just keeps dodging us. Finally the dog spots a biker off the main road and proceeds to chase it, followed by it getting smacked by a car. My grandmother screams and my dad runs out of the house. All as my bus is pulling up. My dad yells, "Just get on the bus." I was horrified and sobbing getting on that bus, waiting all day at school, knowing that dog would never survive. She still left that day and drove 18 hours alone. Must have been terrible. Okay, I have a good one. My friends and I were in 7th or 8th grade and we were bored with nothing to do. Not into drugs and alcohol at the time and it was such a nice day we wanted to head outside. So in the development we lived in there was an area known as the coal dumps. Just mounds and mounds of coal tucked away in the back. Occasionally we'd hang out there and half paintball airsoft gun wars. But today all we had was some matches. There was a squirt bottle of lighter fluid and some cardboard there so we began to light small fires and stomp them out. We'd pass it around and you'd make a fire and then stomp it out when you deemed fit. These fires were small, manageable and everything was under control until our one friend decided he wanted a bigger challenge. He wanted a bigger fire. So, he poured lighter fluid and kept pouring lighter fluid and he tossed a match in and it was a decently sized fire. But he wanted more, so he tossed the entire bottle in. Soon, the fire became just a bit too large. A bit larger than we could handle. We just looked at it and didn't stomp it. Then one of our friends just ran away, sprinted towards the trees away from the fire. We were confused and weren't sure what to do. So we just slowly backed away in hopes it'd burn out and it was. Slowly. But then our friend that ran away came back holding 2 large cans that were sloshing all about and he yelled, "Get the frick out of the way." He threw the liquid onto the fire and the flames shot up even fire. They had been at least 15 feet tall. He thought it was water, but it was actually some sort of flammable liquid. The cans were dark so the color of the liquid wasn't obvious and in my friend's panicked state of mind, he didn't think to use his nose. It went from a stupid game to where we thought we were gonna burn down the entire development. In retrospect, the situation wasn't that bad. Mainly because one of our friend's older brothers showed up and put the fire out. It was pretty scary ATM. The situation was 10 years ago. I was in history class. I had my period, but I thought it was ending sooner than it was and assumed the flow was light. I used a pad and was wearing a skirt, no tights. At some point I must have moved slightly, causing the pad to dislodge a bit, enough to provide the perfect channel for my blood flow. At the end of the lesson I looked down and to my absolute horror blood had streamed down the inside of both my legs and pooled in my shoes. It was completely noticeable and the blood dried to a horrible dark brown color. On D-Day, the Germans had the worst luck. It was very stormy, and the Germans didn't think the invasion would come that day. Germany's top general Rommel didn't think the invasion would come that day, so he went over 100 miles away to give his wife a birthday gift. All of the other top military leaders were also very far away from Normandy. Only Rommel and Hitler had power to call in the tanks to the beach. Neither were present. Hitler was sleeping during the start of the invasion, and neither of his assistants woke him up. If those things were different, Germany probably could have stopped the invasion of France. Happened at a party about 4 hours ago, still petrified. This party was kinda a celebration, but I drank a little too much and had to crap badly. I asked the host if I could use the bathroom, but instead he grabs toilet paper and says back alley. First I think, no. But I went and crapped behind a dumpster about half a block away from the festivities. Well, as soon as I released this tsunami, this old lady began to bring her garbage to the very dumpster. Needless to say, she freaked crap and I ran home drunk as frick. 0/10 never happening again. Actually happened with me. Got towed to a missing person. This person was a high-risk case, without going into enough detail for it to be figured out, so we were towed within 1 hour of them going missing. To get to our staging area, spend 3 hours and hike 20 miles searching. By the time we get out of the woods, there are close to 300 people, a media post, an incident command post, a first responder registration position, multiple rehab facilities, porta-johns, a mobile comms center, all set up on a 2-lane road. We still thought it would be resolved that night. Then the next morning, the temp dropped from 50s to around 10 degrees with a -20 wind chill. The first responders were getting hypothermia, several broken legs from falls. It was around this point we knew this would be a problem. Of course, the person was dressed for 50s, and so we knew odds had hit about as low as they could once it hit 10 degrees. Search continued for a total of 7 days, almost to the minute, covered around 300 square miles, included something like 30 agencies and several thousand people. Victim was eventually found. DOA. As I look back on it, I'm not sure there's anything we could have done better. We had helicopters with thermal imaging night vision in the air within 1 hour. We had special ops SAR teams and search dogs on the ground within 4 hours. From a first responder point of view, it was a truly amazing featuring off logistics to make everything happen. Make it happen as quickly as it did, and with as few injuries as it did. This terrain was heck. At one point I hiked through a solid mile of thorn bushes, but even the best couldn't turn a positive result. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.